I thought I had everything: a loving husband, a beautiful family, a life others envied. But one mistake changed everything, and now I'm standing at the edge of the wreckage wondering if there's any way back. Bonnie Parker kept a satisfied smile on her face as she maneuvered her BMW onto the bustling Atlanta freeway. Even though she was running later than planned, she barely gave it a second thought. After all, Atlanta's notorious traffic delays were just a part of life. A little extra time on the road was a small price to pay for the joy Nick had brought into her world. Nick was nearly 10 years younger than her, a fact that only added to his allure. He was more than just a passionate lover. He was charming, intelligent, and effortlessly engaging. With his youthful energy, he reignited a kind of excitement in Bonnie that she hadn't felt in years. But then, as always, thoughts of Ron crept in, bringing a twinge of guilt. Her husband at 44 didn't have Nick's raw stamina, but what he lacked in youth he made up for with experience, patience, and a deep understanding of Bonnie's body. Their intimate life had always been fulfilling, at least until Nick entered the picture. Now, nothing compared to the feeling of leaving one man's arms only to fall into another's, each relationship giving her something the other couldn't. The realization that she was living in the best of both worlds made her smile grow even wider. Bonnie was more than just a devoted wife and mother, she was also a highly respected professional. As a senior architect at a well-known firm, she held an esteemed position in her field. She took pride in always being impeccably dressed, carrying herself with an air of confidence that made her a role model, not just at work but even among her teenage son Casey's friends. On weekends, their home often became the gathering spot for his classmates, and Bonnie enjoyed the role of the cool mom, offering advice and a listening ear while maintaining her image as a sophisticated authority figure. However, as she finally pulled into the driveway, a strange feeling settled in her chest. The house was eerily quiet. Neither Ron nor Casey seemed to be home. That was odd. Ron was never one to stay late at work, and Casey should have been back from school by now. Tomorrow was Thursday, there was no reason for them to be out this late. Trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine, Bonnie carried her things inside and made her way to the bedroom. She unpacked absent-mindedly, the silence of the house gnawing at her nerves. A hot shower would clear her mind, she thought. Maybe they'd just gone out for a quick errand. As she reached for her phone, another realization hit her. It had been off since the night before. She had turned it off during dinner with Nick and had forgotten to switch it back on. Had Ron or Casey tried to reach her? Brushing off her unease, Bonnie tried to focus on the evening ahead. Maybe she'd surprise her colleagues tomorrow by treating them to a nice dinner at that upscale restaurant they had all been raving about. A little unexpected indulgence could make the workweek more bearable. Still, even as she headed for the shower, a nagging feeling lingered in the back of her mind. Something didn't feel right. I bought a pearl necklace and thought it would be a nice touch to have it delivered to her table during dinner, Ron said, a hint of excitement in his voice. My daughter can take care of the arrangements, Boyd suggested. She's already in college and knows all the best spots in the city. I appreciate that, Ron replied with a nod. I have a few special plans for when Bonnie gets home as well. Among the guests gathered for the evening were Ron's parents, Bonnie's parents, his brother and sister-in-law, as well as Bonnie's younger sister, who had been divorced for a few years now. Everyone was eagerly anticipating Bonnie's arrival, especially since Ron had planned a heartfelt surprise for her. In addition to the adult guests, Casey, Ron and Bonnie's 16-year-old daughter, was present with a group of her friends. The entire evening had been meticulously arranged, with the highlight being a special video, queued up and ready to play on the large screen. You want this anniversary to be unforgettable, huh? A voice teased from across the table. Sounds like you're planning to outshine your honeymoon. Bonnie smirked, meeting the stranger's playful gaze. Well then you'd better order a steak, she quipped. You're going to need your strength. The stranger chuckled. Your honeymoon must have been amazing, unless of course you already had a lover back then. I find it hard to believe that any man is as perfect as your husband seems. Bonnie rolled her eyes with a grin. Thanks for your concern, but Ron did a fantastic job planning this evening. She raised her glass. And for the record, he's the only lover I've ever had. Later in the evening, as Bonnie admired the pearl necklace, she turned to Nick with a soft smile. Will you help me put it on? Of course, he murmured, carefully fastening the clasp around her neck. His fingers lightly brushed against her collarbone, sending a shiver down her spine. You have a very romantic husband, a woman at the next table remarked, watching the moment unfold. You're lucky to have such a handsome man. Nick flashed a knowing grin. Absolutely, he agreed. Bonnie savored the moment. She had a devoted husband and a charming lover, a perfect balance. She glanced at Nick, but the older women nearby merely chuckled at his response, their eyes filled with amused wisdom. I gave you a pearl necklace just yesterday, Ron's voice echoed in her mind. Bonnie's mother stood nearby, frozen in uncertainty, as an uneasy silence settled over the room. I think we might be misunderstanding the situation, one of the guests said gently. Bonnie genuinely cares about you, Ron. She would do anything for Casey. Please don't make any rash decisions. Several of the other guests nodded in agreement, sharing their thoughts in a calm, measured discussion. Ron sat in silence, absorbing their words. After a long pause, he finally exhaled and spoke. I need time to process all of this, he admitted. Please just give me some space to figure out my next step. You can all go now. One by one, the guests took their leave, offering Ron quiet words of support as they stepped out. The house fell silent. Meanwhile, across town, Bonnie felt the weight of unease settle over her as she picked up her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she finally dialed. Mom, it's me, she said, bracing herself for what was bound to be a difficult conversation. Her mother's voice came through, sharp and full of disappointment. Is everything okay? Oh, Bonnie, only if you think losing your husband, losing your daughter, humiliating your parents and behaving like... She stopped herself, then sighed. Like someone I barely recognize. If that's normal to you, then sure, everything's fine. Bonnie's heart clenched. Mom, please. I completely forgot I had turned off my phone last night. I just now saw your calls. Her mother cut in. Ron wanted to surprise you. He wanted us to see your reaction to his gift. We had planned to call and congratulate you on your anniversary. Her voice grew thick with sadness. Looks like this might be your last anniversary, at least with Ron. Bonnie swallowed the lump in her throat. Mom, you know I love Ron, she insisted. This other man, he meant nothing. It was just something to pass the time. Those conferences were exhausting and I just... Don't justify it, Bonnie, her mother said, her voice heavy with disappointment. Your father and I aren't ending our relationship over this. Please come home so we can talk this through. Bonnie hesitated, then asked cautiously, Where's Dad? A long silence followed before her mother finally answered. He moved into the cottage by the lake. I don't think he wants to see you, Casey said, her voice laced with disappointment. Last night he was so excited, Mom. He invited everyone to watch you open your gift. He was happy. And then, you walked in with your lover instead of Sue. Bonnie felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Please, Casey, she pleaded, desperation creeping into her voice. Come home. Let's talk. I need to fix this. But Casey only sighed, and after a long pause the line went dead. Bonnie exhaled shakily, rubbing her temples as she tried to steady herself. A deep sense of regret settled over her, but there was no undoing what had been done. Meanwhile, Ron had already returned home, his silence heavier than any argument they could have had. Without a word, he headed straight for the bathroom. The sound of running water filled the house, leaving Bonnie alone with her thoughts. She busied herself in the kitchen, making coffee, as if the simple act could restore some sense of normalcy. A few minutes later, Ron emerged from the bathroom, his hair damp, his face unreadable. He walked into the kitchen and Bonnie seized the moment. She placed a mug of coffee in front of him, hoping, praying, that this would be the moment he finally spoke. That they could start this painful but necessary conversation. But Ron didn't say a word. He simply sat down, taking a slow sip, his expression distant. Bonnie swallowed hard, the silence unbearable. Ron, I'm really sorry for what happened, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I appreciate you even being here. I just want to. Ron finally looked up. His eyes were cold. What exactly do you think we need to talk about? He asked, his tone unsettlingly calm. Bonnie felt her stomach twist. You know what the problem is? She said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Do I? Ron said, raising an eyebrow. Why don't you tell me what the problem is? She clenched her fists. Ron, don't do this. You overheard my conversation. You know that you lied, Ron interrupted. That you told me you were going to dinner with Sue but actually went with Nick. That you not only betrayed me but also did it so carelessly that our entire family found out at the same time I did. So tell me, Bonnie, what exactly do you think the problem is? Bonnie's voice cracked. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But she took a deep breath, willing herself to stay composed. Nick and I were only together 3 times, she confessed, tears slipping down her cheeks. Besides you, he's the only man. Ron let out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it. Oh well, that makes it better, doesn't it? His voice rose with anger now, his composure slipping. 3 times? Just 3? And I'm supposed to feel what, relieved? Bonnie wiped at her tears, but nothing could erase the weight of his disappointment. Ron shook his head, his jaw tightening. You conveniently left out the details earlier, Bonnie. You wanted to clear your name, make yourself seem like the victim of some minor mistake. But let's be real here, you weren't just lying to me. You were lying to yourself. The room fell into silence again, but this time it was different. This wasn't just the quiet before a storm. This was the moment everything fell apart. You're the only man I've been with since we got married 2 decades ago, Bonnie insisted, her voice trembling. Nick and I spent 2 nights together, that's all. Ron scoffed, shaking his head. Oh well, in that case I suppose that makes it acceptable, right? His voice dripped with sarcasm. So what's the threshold, Bonnie? 2 nights is fine, but 3 would have been too much. Bonnie swallowed, struggling to find the right words. You know, Ron continued, bitterness creeping into his tone, if sleeping with someone is just about attraction and success, then why stop at Nick? There are plenty of charming, accomplished men out there. Maybe even our neighbor, Mr. Jenkins. Why not give yourself to him too? Bonnie flinched at the accusation. That's not fair, she said, feeling foolish. I never said I sleep with every man who means nothing to me. Ron leaned forward, eyes locked on hers. Then explain it to me, Bonnie. What made Nick so special? She hesitated before answering. Nick was charming, confident, he pursued me, and yes, I was attracted to him. But does that mean I'd fall into bed with every attractive, successful man who shows interest? Does that, aside from this one mistake, make me an unfaithful wife? Ron let out a bitter laugh. If you don't have feelings for the men you're sneaking around with, then you don't love me either, he said, his voice heavy with resentment. Bonnie felt her stomach twist. She could see the pain in his eyes, the way his mind was replaying everything he had overheard. You think Nick and I sat around laughing at you? Bonnie asked, feeling defensive. Ron, he never spoke badly about you. I would never let that happen. But Ron couldn't shake the memory, the conversation he had overheard, the cruel words, the way Bonnie had seemed to agree with them. His chest tightened at the thought. I can't erase it from my mind, he whispered, his voice raw. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken emotions. Then suddenly Ron snapped back to the present, realization dawning on him. You know when things really started to change between us? He asked, his tone sharp. It was when you began staying overnight with that Romeo from the Chicago office. That's when everything shifted. I don't want to be your cover while you carry on your affairs, Bonnie. Bonnie's breath caught in her throat. Ron, you called Sue, didn't you? She asked, her stomach sinking. I told her the truth, Ron replied, his voice steady but cold. That I never attended those last 2 conferences. Bonnie's face paled. I thought you told her we were going together. That we were sharing a room, she said, resentment creeping into her voice. Sue had looked at her differently since then, Bonnie realized. Like she knew. Like she felt deceived. Bonnie turned away, feeling the weight of her actions closing in on her. No matter how she tried to justify it, there was no undoing what had already been done. I'm shocked that I've been dragged into this, Sue said, her voice laced with disappointment. When Bonnie returned, Ron refused to listen to her excuses. The betrayal cut too deep. The thought of life without her weighed on him, but what hurt even more was her disregard for his feelings, the way she had tossed aside loyalty and respect like they meant nothing. Her unexpected arrival the following day only highlighted the vast emotional gap between them. She offered no explanation that could erase the sting of her infidelity, no words that could make him forget. The damage was done. The day after meeting with his lawyer, Ron was in his office, preparing to leave for the day, when he found Bonnie's letter on his desk. Despite all the doubts, my love for you remains unshaken. Her confession, raw and vulnerable, caught him off guard. He could see the sincerity in her words, the genuine plea for forgiveness. Bonnie had always been a woman who held herself, and those around her, to impossibly high standards. And now she was owning her mistakes, fully acknowledging the pain she had caused. Ron swallowed hard. He was overwhelmed with grief, but despite everything he couldn't bring himself to respond. Some wounds ran too deep for words. Since Bonnie's unexpected visit to Ron's lake house that morning, Casey had remained distant. When she finally spoke, her tone carried a mix of anger and hurt. You always said Dad was the most loyal, honest person you've ever known, Casey said, her voice cold. Please, just tell me the truth. Bonnie felt a lump form in her throat. Forgive us both for our doubts, she said softly, hoping to bridge the widening gap between them. But Casey wasn't ready to let it go. "This isn't the first time you've been with him, is it?" she accused. "You've been hiding this from us for years." Bonnie felt the walls around her carefully constructed facade begin to crumble. She couldn't lie anymore. Tears welled in her eyes as she took a deep breath. "I was with him at 3 different conferences," she admitted. "It was a terrible mistake, one I regret more than anything. I'm so sorry." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. And for the first time Bonnie realized, there were no words that could fix what had been broken. "I was wrong." Bonnie's voice trembled as she spoke, but Casey's expression remained cold and unmoved. "Is that all you have to say?" her daughter asked, arms crossed. "Mom, you betrayed Dad in the worst way possible. Didn't you promise to be faithful?" Bonnie opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. What excuse could she possibly offer? Meanwhile, whispers of her infidelity had spread beyond their family. Both single and married men who had once admired her from afar now spoke of her in hushed tones, fueling the rumors that had reached their social circles. Ron, on the other hand, threw himself into his work. Business became his refuge, offering him a sense of control amid the chaos his personal life had become. Ironically, when the divorce settlement was finalized, Bonnie was left stunned. Ron had willingly given her half of his share in the company. Even his lawyer had tried to argue against it, attempting every legal strategy to minimize her claim. But Ron had been firm in his decision. Bonnie couldn't comprehend it. A few years ago she would have never imagined this outcome. As summer approached, Casey made a decision of her own. She would spend the entire break at the lake house, just as she had between her junior and senior years of high school. Bonnie realized that this was yet another way for her daughter to distance herself, a silent form of punishment. And honestly, she deserved it. Ron, however, was pleased with how things had unfolded. He had carefully planned the lake house expansion, increasing its size by nearly half. With his construction expertise, the project moved swiftly, and by the end of July, the once cozy cabin had transformed into a spacious retreat with 3 bedrooms, each with its own private view of the water. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Casey studied her father with a knowing smile. "You know, Dad," she began casually, "I met someone today." Ron raised an eyebrow. "Oh. She's sweet," Casey continued. "I wouldn't mind if you took her on a date. It might be good for you to have someone to lean on while you're moving on from everything." Ron chuckled, shaking his head. "Please don't even mention marriage," he said. "I've been there before and once was more than enough." Casey smirked. "I'm not suggesting anything serious. Just, maybe open yourself up to the idea." "Thanks for keeping me updated on my own love life," Ron teased. Meanwhile, Bonnie found herself in an unexpected situation of her own. Seated at a large table with colleagues, she graciously accepted an invitation to join a discussion with the company's advertising team. As introductions were exchanged, the conversation naturally found its rhythm. One woman from the advertising group stood out. She had a warmth about her, an effortless charm that made people gravitate toward her. Bonnie found herself smiling at the woman's infectious humor, feeling drawn in despite herself. When the group playfully teased her, the woman grinned. "Not all of us are lucky enough to have a mansion on the lake," she joked. Bonnie extended her hand. "I'm Bonnie Parker," she said with a small smile. "I didn't catch your name," Bonnie said, offering a polite smile. "Patty Lawson," the young woman replied, her tone slightly shy. Bonnie studied her for a moment. Ron had once called her a beauty, but Patty seemed unaware of just how striking she was. Maybe she underestimated herself, or maybe Bonnie had simply been blinded by the past. "I hope you're not upset that I'm living with Ron now," Patty asked hesitantly. Bonnie shook her head, offering a small, resigned smile. "I can't blame you for that," she admitted. "You're a beautiful young woman with an incredible figure. It's easy to see why Ron is drawn to you." Patty shifted uncomfortably, but Bonnie wasn't finished. "I just wonder why Casey hasn't mentioned you before." "She's been focused on her own future," Patty replied. "She's determined to succeed in marketing." Bonnie nodded with approval. "That sounds like Casey. She's always been driven." A sudden shift in the conversation caught Bonnie off guard. "Mom," Casey asked, tilting her head, "when are you going to start dating again? Did you ever talk to Nick after the conferences? Do you think you two could work things out?" Bonnie hesitated for a moment before shaking her head. "Nick isn't the kind of man I'd want a relationship with," she admitted. "He's shallow, self-absorbed, and vain. I only saw him as a distraction. I never thought he'd end up making my life miserable." A lump formed in her throat as she continued, her voice softer now. The truth is, I never expected to lose Ron. He was my anchor, always there when I needed him. I was naive enough to believe that no matter what I did, he'd still be waiting for me at home. She turned to Casey, her expression serious. I hope that when you're ready to settle down, you find someone like your father. And I hope you learn from my mistakes. Don't take more than you give in a relationship. Stay loyal. Stay honest. If you ever have doubts or fears, talk about them before it's too late. Casey listened quietly, absorbing her mother's words. Bonnie sighed. Love isn't always grand gestures and whirlwind passion. Sometimes it's about the everyday moments, the small, seemingly mundane choices, like deciding what color to paint the house or calling someone to pump the septic tank. She let out a small, self-deprecating laugh. Those things may not seem romantic, but they're part of a life built together. She looked off in the distance, a wistful expression on her face. Ron was more than just a husband. He was a steady businessman, a loyal friend, and most importantly, a wonderful father. And now he belonged to someone else. I will always love him, Bonnie admitted, her voice tinged with sorrow. Even after betraying him in the most unforgivable way, I can't change how I feel. I've learned my lesson, but I doubt that will make a difference now. She forced a small smile, glancing at Patty. Besides, Ron is a great catch. I don't think his bed will stay empty for long. Patty smiled back, a knowing look in her eyes. That's actually why I wanted to tell you first. What you do with this information, that's up to you. Bonnie only nodded, unsure if she even had the right to feel anything about Ron moving on. Just a week later, she received an unexpected invitation. Ron's best friend and longtime business partner, Dan, had asked her to meet him for lunch at a bistro. The place was bustling with people, but they managed to find a quiet table in the corner. After a few pleasantries, Dan wasted no time getting to the point. We need to talk about the company, he said, his tone businesslike. I know you and Ron still own shares, but I think it's time we move forward. Bonnie listened as he laid out his proposal. Look, Bonnie, Dan continued, lowering his voice slightly. We should focus on making a quick profit from the land sale. Long-term planning is fine, but personally, I prefer to see the money now. You and I each own a third of the shares. If we work together, we can put pressure on Ron to accept the offer, cash out, and split the profits. Bonnie narrowed her eyes. Ron won't be hurt by this, Dan added quickly. In fact, he'd walk away with $500,000 in cash. That's more than enough to smooth things over. Bonnie felt a slow burn of frustration rising in her chest. You really don't know him at all, do you? She said, her voice sharp. Ron doesn't make decisions based on quick cash grabs. And if you think I'd go along with this just to line my pockets, you're wrong. Dan shifted uncomfortably but didn't back down. Bonnie, this is a smart move. There's no reason to make this personal. Bonnie's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. No reason, she repeated, her voice laced with anger. I failed as a wife. That's something I'll have to live with. But now, you've made it clear that you're not much of a friend or a business partner either. She pushed back her chair and stood. Ron will manage my share of the company for as long as I'm alive, she declared. And after I'm gone, my will ensures that he inherits it outright. He built this business with integrity, and I won't be part of anything that betrays that. Dan opened his mouth to argue, but Bonnie was already reaching into her purse. She placed enough cash on the table to cover her untouched lunch, then turned on her heel and walked away without another word. Later that evening, as she reflected on the day, she found herself recalling Ron's words from years ago. There were always other qualities about you that I found much more attractive, he had once told her. Back then she had believed those words meant forever. Now she wasn't so sure. I don't think I've ever heard you call them qualities before, Bonnie said, still smiling. Ron met her gaze. Yes, you have, he countered. You've always had a certain strength, Bonnie. I couldn't help but get caught up in it. She tilted her head, studying him. And now? Has Patty completely won you over? Ron exhaled, shaking his head slightly. There's definitely chemistry, he admitted. Bonnie nodded, her expression unreadable. She admires you, you know. Her high opinion of you is one of the main reasons I'm here. Ron frowned slightly. What do you mean? One of her friends overheard something recently, Bonnie explained. There's talk about you selling the land and splitting the profits. Ron's jaw tightened. Let me guess, Dan's behind this? Bonnie sighed. Dan is putting a lot of pressure on me. I suspect he needs the money. That sounds about right, Ron muttered. He's convinced that if we sell the property, we'll each walk away with $500,000 and no one gets hurt. Bonnie studied him carefully. And what do you think? Ron leaned back, folding his arms. I think you already know. A small smile played at Bonnie's lips. I have a feeling you've got bigger plans for that site. Ones that could bring real success to the company and earn respect in the community. There was pride in her voice. You've never been the kind of man who chases quick money, Ron. That's what makes you different. Ron's expression softened for just a moment before he nodded. I've always tried to think long-term. For myself and for Casey. He glanced out the window. Over the years we've built something solid. The house is nearly paid off and thanks to the upgrades it's worth even more. That puts us in a strong position financially. He turned back to Bonnie. If we really want to shut Dan down, we could buy out his share. Bonnie considered this. That makes sense. Ron hesitated. But now that we're divorced, the house belongs to you. Are you ready to sell it and reinvest in the business? Bonnie inhaled deeply, thinking it over. I'm not sure, she admitted. I know you've been working on a deal to build an emergency center on that land. I can't promise you'll make a profit on my investment, but I do believe in what you're doing. Ron studied her carefully. That's not an easy decision to make. Bonnie let out a quiet laugh. No, but I've made harder ones. Ron smirked, shaking his head. You know, not every woman would be comfortable spending the night under the same roof as her ex. Bonnie raised an eyebrow. And yet here I am. Even if you were in my house, Ron added, his tone teasing, it's highly unlikely you'd find a woman who'd agree to live with her ex. Bonnie chuckled. I wouldn't be so sure, she said. Over the years, I've seen plenty of women fall in love with you. Ron held her gaze for a moment before looking away. This conversation was different. They weren't just talking about business or mistakes. They were acknowledging something deeper, something unfinished. And neither of them knew exactly what to do with that. I ended our marriage because you cheated on me with that man, Ron said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. And then I let Patty move in with me. Looking back, I don't think either of those decisions set a great example for Casey. He exhaled, shaking his head. The truth is I've been struggling. Bonnie swallowed hard. Ron, I never meant to hurt you like this. If something was wrong in our marriage or even in our intimacy, you could have told me, Ron admitted. I would have done everything in my power to fix it, if I had known. Bonnie's eyes filled with regret. I was stupid, Ron. But I wasn't unhappy. You were an incredible husband, a fantastic father to Casey, and a passionate lover. I lost my way. She paused, her voice trembling. And now, I think I deserve to be unhappy. Ron frowned. Strangely, I find some sense of satisfaction in my suffering, Bonnie continued. It's like I'm atoning for my mistakes. Ron studied her for a moment before speaking. Why don't you at least come see the lake house? He offered. Bonnie hesitated but then nodded. I'd like that. Later that afternoon, as Ron led her through the remodeled home, Bonnie was stunned. You really did a fantastic job, she said, running her fingers over the elegant woodwork. Casey has a spacious room with her own private bathroom, Ron pointed out. She loves it here. Bonnie's expression softened. I can see why. As they stood in the warmth of the newly renovated home, a quiet tension settled between them. Bonnie turned to Ron, studying his face. So, you're suggesting we share a bed? She asked, raising an eyebrow in disbelief. Ron let out a deep sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. Ever since I found out about your infidelity and walked away, I felt awful. I miss you. Terribly. To the point where it physically hurts sometimes. His voice thickened with emotion. You made a huge mistake, Bonnie. And yeah, being with Patty dulled the pain for a while. But it never erased it. Bonnie's breath hitched. I want to move forward, Ron admitted. I don't know how yet, but I want to believe we can get past this. That we can rebuild. Bonnie's heart pounded. She had never expected to hear those words. Ron cleared his throat, shifting gears. In the meantime, I've been negotiating with the main hospital to secure a long-term lease for an emergency care center on the land. It won't be as profitable as the luxury condominiums Dan is pushing for, but it'll still bring in solid revenue and create stable jobs. Bonnie nodded, admiration flickering in her eyes. It won't just be good for business, it'll help people. And that's what matters. For the first time in a long time, she saw something in Ron's eyes that she feared she'd lost forever.